Wonderful, and good evening, and thank you for coming along. It's lovely to be here. As I said earlier, if there are things that I've said that you would like clarification on, please do yell out. A bit harder if you're online, but I guess if there's something, I don't know if there's a chat online, you can put your hand up and yell out. If there's something I'm getting horribly wrong, please also let me know. As this is a library lecture, I thought it would be really good to essentially just talk about some items we have in the collection here, some of which Erin has on display for us, and some of them which are behind locked glass panels so that no one can touch them. But we can definitely have a look at them afterwards as well. And we can use, essentially we're going to use these artifacts that we have in the library as a starting point to discuss related points. I'm going to begin by discussing a couple of things that haven't changed over time, so things that are probably more recent but are very emblematic of things that have existed for quite some time. But then I'm going to move into the early modern period and talk about some items in the collection which signal innovations and progressions which lead into the sorts of things that we have today. So that you can keep track of where I'm up to, I'm going to talk about the two items actually that are over there first, and then I'm going to talk about three which are certainly much, much older. So to start off, it's important to mention that the Donald Robinson Library's rare book collection is quite wonderful. By old books, though, we're talking about 500 years old. We're not talking, say, 1,000 years. If we went back 1,000 years, we'd get up to, say, the Sassoon Codex, which has been in the news recently. It's on sale for about $30 to $50 million. So that's sort of the time when that one was around, as well as the Aleppo and the Leningrad codices, which you may well be familiar with. The latter, the Leningrad Codex, forms the basis for most of our modern, or pretty much all of our modern Hebrew and English Bible. So that's 1,000 years ago. If we go back another 1,000 years, we're at the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, those famous manuscripts and fragments found in a series of caves near the Dead Sea. And that was about 70 years ago now. And they date from 250 to 70. So we're not going back quite that old. We're still in the modern period, but we're at the early modern period. But I did, as I say, I thought I'd just start by talking about two of these items which are on display here for us. And they're probably the most recent in the collection in terms of old books. This first one is a piece of a Leviticus scroll, which is part of a collection. It was probably produced, we think, in the 19th century in Palestine. And there are a couple of things that are interesting about it. It gives us, again, this scroll is probably the same sort of scroll, produced in the same way as scrolls have been produced since forever and still are. It was apparently liberated from a synagogue wall during the Arab-Jewish conflict of the 1920s, a very turbulent time in that region as opposed to today. The scroll which you can see over there, and there's a bit of a note as well about the provenance of that. The scroll contains several chapters of Leviticus from partway through chapter 7 on the first column until chapter 9 on the fourth, so again reading right to left. You can see some features that are pretty common for Hebrew text. They're lined up perfectly on either side of the line. And that's something I've seen in most biblical texts from antiquity onwards, late antiquity onwards. On the next picture, you can see, I've sort of done a bit of a zoom in. You can see there are ruler lines on the side that sort of keeps the writing in check. So they'll do that, they'll scrape into the leather. And in the blank space, there's some Chinese, which I'll come back to. It was a bit weird, but I'll explain why. On the other side, part of the same column, sort of in line with the blank space, you can see another great feature, which are these thick, long lines. So if you're reading other ancient manuscripts in other languages, essentially they just write to the end of the line, whatever part of the word they're up to, they just start again, or they just sort of flip over and begin on the next line, particularly in Greek manuscripts you might have seen. But Hebrew manuscripts never split words like this. They do everything they can to ensure that each line is perfectly in line. They justify the texts. So rather than hyphenating words like we might do in English, they elongate certain letters to ensure they fill up right to the end of the line. And so you've got here, every time the word ephod appears, in Leviticus, that's Leviticus 8:7, if you're following along, the dalet, the D, is elongated so that you get to the end of the line. The fact that it's 3 times, though, on that same letter, so you can see the ephod, and then you've got ephod there, and then you've got the verb to, to put on an ephod or to do something with an ephod. It's the same letter each time. For comparison, I just found this one when I was doing some research on Wikipedia. You can see they've got a super long dalet there, which makes me wonder whether they're doing something special there. This is a Shema scroll, so this is a Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. The Lord is your God. The Lord is one. The final D there on Echad, one, is lengthened. There's actually a fun story my medieval tutor told me about. If you ever, why do we always lengthen the dalet, one might ask? Well, it's because every time you hear a bee buzzing, you remember to say Echav. So you don't say Echad, you say Echav, and the bee will remind you that the Lord is one. Anyway, fun aside story. And it's interesting that it's the same letter as the dalet that's been lengthened in that Leviticus scroll. The other little feature there, you can see it looks like a lot of the letters are sprouting. They're sprouting little fungi or something. When I first saw them, I called them crowns, these little decorations. Then I did some research and found that's actually what they're called. They're called tagin, or a tag is singular. Some letters have 3, others have 1. The rest of the letters don't have them, and there are rules and there are mnemonics to remember which letters do have these tags or tagin and which ones don't. So there's a mnemonic for which have 3 and which have 1. If you're ever having to draw a Hebrew manuscript, that'll come in handy. Otherwise, just the ones that have it should have it, the ones that don't. You'll pretty much only see tagin on proper Torah manuscripts. You won't see them on other scrolls. But they are, again, quite pretty, and they point to the care taken not just to get the letters right, but to illuminate and make it as beautiful, to, adorn in every way the Word of God. There are 1 or 2 other features which I wanted to mention. One is what I said before about the top of the scroll. I asked my colleagues at church what was going on there, and they just said, I thought it would be something quite interesting. They said, it's just the verse references in Chinese, so it's actually not that interesting, except that, again, you've got Chinese and a Hebrew text. I think, and if you read a bit more about the scroll afterwards, you'll see it's an example, again, of how people add to manuscripts over time. In this context, it's helping people in a Chinese context work with the scroll to more quickly identify the verses, just as we'll have in our Bibles. We'll have English or Latin headings over a Greek or Hebrew text. Just helps us identify where we're up to, even though we'll have to do a bit more work to read the text. And so while to have Chinese is weird, it gives us an insight into the history that this was taken from Jerusalem, from Palestine, brought to Australia, and then taken with a missionary to China who was working there, and then brought back here to the library. It also explains why someone's written Leviticus 8 right in the middle. I thought it was Leviticus 9, but I had a really close look, and you can have a look later. You can see it's actually 8. I thought they got something wrong, but they were right. It's just the scroll was defective. There's a bit of a hole there. You'll also see there's a couple of horizontal gaps there. The horizontal gaps are so there's one on first and second columns, so they're open gaps, and where the new line starts with the next line, and then in the third column there, I put that down in the corner, you can see that it's a closed break, and maybe Evan can correct me, it's counterintuitive. I think the open gaps are the small breaks, and the closed gaps are the big breaks. Does that sound right? I don't know, I trust you know these things. Anyway, maybe someone online will tell me if I'm wrong. I think that's what's going on there. The open breaks are the little ones, so this first one here is Leviticus 7, 11 to 12, which is just another sacrifice. So here's a list of different offerings, whereas the closed gap there is a much bigger break. That's closer to what we call a chapter break. So these are quite ancient, these breaks. You can see them in Qumran texts as well. But they're also linked to reading plans. So there are reading plans in the Torah in particular. There are some which help us break the text up into weekly or daily synagogue readings. All right, that's the first text. Second, we're going to take, before I look at the other one, which is also over there, a little detour. Here are some illuminated manuscripts, which I had a look at Sydney University. So they're down in the basement of Fisher Library there, from their own rare book collection. And you can see that they've drawn with Hebrew letters some beautiful pictures. So you've got a candlestick, you've got a jug, and I'm going to say a fish balancing on a cat kissing a fish or something. I don't know what it is. But except for that one, they're pretty much all drawn just with letters. And so again, they're trying to, these are in the margins to try and make the text a bit more interesting. Different to tug in, which are on the letters, this is next to it. Next level are things like this, which is just, it's like a children's book, but someone has had a lot of time and they just keep drawing. So they're really quite beautiful books, very labour intensive. You can see colour inside and outside. You can see pictures all around. I guess it's the literary equivalent of putting gargoyles on a cathedral. Yeah, it's quite amazing what they've done there. And in particular, and the reason I'm going to draw attention to this is you can see that there's this physics-defying gallows that has been drawn in between the list of the names of Haman's sons. So after Haman was executed, his 10 sons were killed. They were hanged as punishment for their father's genocidal conspiracy. So I don't know when the first Bible was printed that had this sort of thing. I've seen other manuscripts where this isn't the case, but in other manuscripts, even my more modern Hebrew Bible has a similar thing. It doesn't have the pictures, it has something more like what we'll see here. So this is the Esther scroll. Aaron and I unrolled it last week and measured it. It's 2.13 metres long, which, I don't know, that seems pretty long to me. It's quite skinny and narrow. You can see there, I can't remember how tall it was, 10 centimetres or something? 13? 8 centimetres tall. So 8 centimetres tall, 2.13 metres long. And apart from the very first column, which is where the handle would have been attached, it's otherwise complete. Now, to refresh your memory, Esther is that story of Purim, where each year the scroll of Esther will be read to celebrate God's miraculous rescue of his people from certain death. And as you're reading through the scroll, as you're unrolling each bit to read the next bit, you're almost at the end. You've only got 25 verses to go, and the text opens up like this into a square. And so even apart from the words that are read, you're sort of looking at a gap, this gallows-shaped gap. And having read 9 chapters of conspiracies and power being used for evil, you hit this gap and your mind fills in the gallows, which I think is quite an amazing thing. You remember that God is sovereign, that God will destroy whoever is against him and his people. He is to be trusted in all circumstances. So it's quite again, without drawing anything, but by not drawing something, using empty space. It's not a picture, but a gap. And so some manuscripts like these ones here will fill in the gaps. This one here leaves it for our imaginations. You can see a couple of other extra features just in this. So the rest of the manuscript's actually quite, I'm not going to say boring, but there's no fun features there. But you can see a couple of things. So you can see that super long, again, another dalet. There's another super long one there on the third last line of the column beforehand. And again, it's so that you space it perfectly so that when you hit the next column that the names of the sons begin. If you did it short then you'd sort of have to start this list on the previous column. There's a couple of other things there that are interesting. You can see there's a decorated iron. So the bottom down here, there's a decorative ayin. It's a large letter, and again it's got the tagin there, so that's the word 10, the 10 sons who were executed. And the other thing I noticed, which I noticed before, I just remembered, is there's some mini letters as well. So as well as this large ayin, you've also got a tiny tav here. So this is a normal size one here, and there's a tiny one there, and there's also a tiny shin there. There's a normal size one there. So they've got these tiny letters. I have Chris Conya's face is very confused. I don't know why it's like that either, but it's a tradition. There's often there's a couple of other letters that are tiny, but for some reason only these two are tiny there as well. But you can see there's all these ways that without adding words or doing anything like that or writing commentary, you're doing extra little things to make it fun. So again, right towards the end of this 2.1 meter scroll, you've got these 5 extra unique elements. Maybe it's just thinking, if you're there and you've been doing this scroll for days or weeks, I don't know how long it would take to do a scroll, you're always looking forward to right at the end you get to do the fun bits maybe. Get to really splurge and just lash out with the big ayin, with the triple crown, the tagin. Okay, so these are not as old, but they're part of a tradition that is much older that began before early modern and continues up until today. And that was, I guess, I showed you them to get our bearings as well as to highlight some artifacts in the collection. Let's move on now to some older elements, and I'm going to start back in 1751. This is a Hebrew Bible which is on display. You can already see the Latin. They don't care about wrapping over the line. They've just gone straight over big letters for the first half of the word and little letters for the next. And I think that's a typo. I don't know Latin, but I think they've repeated the TIO. It's printed in Germany. It's a Hebrew Bible, so we call it a Tanakh, which is an abbreviation for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the law, prophets, and writings, Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Many of you will be aware, but for those who don't, this is the normal order of a Hebrew Bible. You've got the law, the prophets, and the writings, the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. But the Greek or English or Latin order is different. Their order sort of same with the law, but history includes parts of what we would call the former prophets, and then the prophets are just the what we would call the latter prophets, and poetic books is a bit of a mix. This picture may not make any sense to you, but this is sort of what's going on. So the Hebrew order is very clear and yellow, green, and pink, whereas history in the Greek order is a bit of writings, a bit of that, bit of prophets. Poetic books is just writings, but then you've got, and then the Greek version of the prophets has one book from the writings. For those who are playing along at home, it's Daniel is part of the writings in the Hebrew order. What is unique about this particular Tanakh is that the order is not a threefold order, so it's not Torah, Nevi, and Ketuvim, but it's split the prophets into the former and latter, which is, again, it's a fourfold order, which is similar but different to the Greek. It has the same titles as before, law, prophets, and writings, but it's split the prophets. And I think the purpose of this is to make it a bit more like the Greek order, but not completely. I haven't done enough research to know how widespread this is. We don't have a lot of books from the early 18th or mid-18th century, if there are other codices with this same division. But it would seem at first glance to be an attempt to make it a bit more familiar to the Greek, English, Latin order, but while keeping the same contents as the Hebrew. So this order, by finishing with the latter prophets, would mean that as Christians, we open the last page you turn back a page from Matthew when you're in Malachi, the end of Malachi, and you're like, yay, and then you turn the page, hey, I've got John the Baptist, and it's very easy to equate Elijah and John the Baptist, whereas normally the latter prophets are before the writings, and you're finishing with 2 Chronicles. Jesus talks about death reigned from Abel to Zechariah, which is at the end of 2 Chronicles, the end of the writings. So I think they're trying to make it a bit more similar, but they haven't gone all the way. So as I said, the writings, the hagiographa, as they're called in Latin, they retain exactly the same as what we'd expect in the Hebrew writings, the Ketuvim. It includes all those books that we might expect from English Bibles to see elsewhere. So it's got Ruth, which we normally have before Samuel. It's got Thrani, which is the Latin for Lamentations, which we would normally expect after Jeremiah, so that's staying in there. And what else? Daniel, of course, which we would expect after the major prophets. And so the writings follow straight on from the end of 2 Kings. There's the 2 Kings where you can see, again, some large letters which say Chadzak v'nit Hadzak, I think, be strong and, I don't know how you translate that, fight bravely or something like that. So that's sort of how you finish 2 Kings, be strong and fight bravely, and then a beautiful wood carving as well. So if I just go back briefly one slide, you can see that one of these is not like the others. So this is the order. They go law, former prophets, writings, latter prophets. But Joshua doesn't get the wood carving at the beginning, and nor does Joshua, which again is the beginning of the prophets, he doesn't get a nice little woodcut with a first letter. You know how you often write a large first letter in like even online articles and things like that? The first letter is large. The way they do that is by having a woodcut, and they would, I guess we were hypothesising they'd have a whole bunch of different woodcuts, and they just find some nice ones, and then they would print the first letter inside that. They'd have a hole for that to put that letter in, which they've done for all of them except for Joshua. Maybe this is a way of saying there's still only 3 divisions, even though we're changing it around. And if we had to choose one of the prophets, we're going to go with Isaiah because he's the good one to start with. That's just my theory. But it is interesting that they've only got that for 3. Another feature that we see in this book, which we see a lot of in books of this era, are multiple books bound together. You'll have a title page at the beginning, you'll read all the way through the book, you'll get to the end of the book, you'll turn the page, and you're in a new book. So there's actually 3 books in one. There's an appendix, so on the far left you've got the Ketuvim and Kriya, which is, I think that's Aramaic for Ketiv and Karei, so that what is written and what is to be read. And then there's a bit of a discussion of them, the different things that are going on there. And then there's a lovely little dictionary as well. So it's a really lovely book. It's a helpful book and quite a beautiful book also. So that's, again, mid-18th century. Going back 150 years from that, we have this one here. Again, it's another compound book. It's a smaller one. It's not the whole Hebrew Bible. The main book is Proverbs, and so essentially what we might call some of the poetic books. So you've got Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. The last 5 are called the 5 Scrolls or the Megalot. These wouldn't always be together. Ruth and Esther would be in our Bibles, English Bibles. Ruth and Esther would be in the history, Lamentations with Jeremiah and so on. But they're placed here together, and then before them in the same volume is the book of Psalms, the Liber Tehillim. When I read the title of Book of Psalms, it's a bit interesting. So you've got 3 options here. You've got the Hebrew, Sefer Tehillim, so just the book of prayers, of Psalms. Then you've got the same translation in Greek, and then you've got this another word which is Liber Psalmorum. So you've got two different options for what you want to call it. I think normally you'd call it just Liber Psalmorum, but they've given you this hybrid Latin-Hebrew title for the book of Psalms. Now inside, again, so you've got 1608 for these poetic books, but there's a note inside this volume which explains that it's from the printer Christophe Plantin, who lived through the 16th century, 1514 to 1589. So perhaps the Psalms volume was published first, and then they thought, hey, let's I've got this other volume printed by someone else, and I'm going to package them together. So that's what I'm thinking there. And again, so wait, where am I up to? What else do I want to say about this? So as we've seen before, there's a nice wood block in this, so you can see the beginning of Book of Psalms, the Aleph there for Ashrei, blessed is the one who. So that's got a nice little wood block there. And there's a couple of other features you can see above every line of the Hebrew. You've got a Latin translation. So, and then in the margins, also got a bit of Hebrew and Latin there. So what I don't know if anyone else has called this. It's not called a reader's Bible, but it essentially is a reader's Bible. So if we zoom in, this is Esther chapter 9. I had a look. There's no fun gallows-shaped gap, which is a bit sad, but it's written for a different purpose. This is written not for Hebrew speakers to meditate on God's deliverance, as the Purim scroll would be, but rather this is written for people to learn Hebrew who can already speak Latin, so that they can use the Latin to help them read. This is by far the oldest interlinear Bible I've ever heard of, so 16th, early 17th century. It's very far away in the Latin from modern sort of idiomatic or paraphrase Bibles. It's rigidly word for word. Interestingly, there's no Vulgate here. It's purely just working from the Hebrew text. And it follows the Hebrew word order. So the letters aren't reversed, but the word order is. So you read the words right to left to follow along with the Hebrew. It's a pointed text. So the scrolls that we have over there have none of the dots for the vowels around it, whereas this one obviously does, so that it can help us read it, help us pronounce it for those who haven't learned the tradition. It also has in the margins a few different things. There's a couple of text critical notes, but primarily, as far as I can work out, not really knowing any Latin, it gives you the roots to the words in the Hebrew text, so that Hebrew students can establish the lexeme which has been conjugated in the text. So to explain what I'm talking about, so if you're learning English and you have the word, the verb to eat, it could be I eat, you ate, he, she, it ate, I'm eating, I ate, I will eat, it's just a word to eat. So you might have he ate, and then the margin you have, that's the verb to eat, just in case you're unsure. Again, that's not the best example. Maybe to be is a better example. So if you're learning to speak English and you come across were or are or is, but in the margin you had to, this is the verb to be. That would help you know regardless of what's happened. In Hebrew, what happens is letters drop out. It's complicated, but essentially they don't care about lots of letters. They just fall out of the text. And so what they're doing here is they're helpfully putting the lexeme in there for us. So I'll give you, right in the middle of the page, there's a little subscript C. You've got the verb, higia? And then in the margin, we're told that's from the verb naga, so to touch or to strike. And they're helping us out with things like that. You might not know what the verb is, but as it's being conjugated, but then you can go to the margin. Oh, that's the verb. Very helpful in Hebrew. Or in the next slide, this is the last bit of Lamentations. that first note there explains that you've got the very final word. So I'm going to move my screen. That very final word there is, I think it's Heshav there. Or maybe it's Teshav. I think it's a Tav. Anyway, I can't quite tell from here. But it tells us that it could be from the verb shuv, to return or to turn back, but the margin tells us it's yashav, which means to dwell or to sit. So you would translate it, not God turned back, but God reigned or something like that. So they're the sort of things that they're doing. They're helping the readers who are learning Hebrew to work out what's going on there when they're still learning their verbs. You can, even if you don't know Latin, as I don't, you can see that this is the Finis Libri Lamentationum, the end of the Book of Lamentations, and then you've got the Hebrew Tam Sefer Kinot. Again, this is weird. So we saw in the earlier thing it was called Kinar. Oh, sorry, it was called what's Latin again for? Thrani, that's right. So it's Thrani in this one, and now we're changing the name to Lamentationum. So again, it means similar things, but it's weird. And again, in Hebrew, the book is Eicha, so how or something like that, the first word of Lamentations, and they're calling it Kinot, so the book of the laments. It's a correct translation, but I think perhaps this signals that there's a default to these printers, publishers, to choose less ordinary titles. Maybe it's a bit of a Protestant taking back the Bible from the church, where we're not going to use your names for books. We're going to choose new names. They're not neglecting the past, but they're being willing to follow alternate paths, new names, new titles, which better reflect the content. So, we don't necessarily call it the Songs of Solomon anymore, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. We just call it Lamentations or Song of Songs. And so we're feeling, perhaps in this time, they're feeling a bit more free to choose alternate paths. But as a whole, though, this volume, it's great. I'd love to have it on my bookshelf. It'd be a wonderful sort of reader's Bible, which would be of great help to Hebrew students. And if George Athos was here, he'd probably say that this is the best one since he put out his own reader's Hebrew Bible about 10 years ago. So only he could improve on this. I feel like I've talked quickly. We're up to my fifth and final one. So I want to talk a little bit about polyglots. We don't have this particular one here, but they're a really important step in the production of Bibles. There's particular technological advances, technical prowess required to produce these sort of things, but they also need great access to new manuscripts that allow them to complete these sort of projects. So this is the most well-known and talked about polyglot. It's called the Complutensian polyglot, or I think it's Jimenez is the cardinal who got it put together. And I'll just leave it up while I talk a bit about sort of where this sits in the landscape and how that fits with what we have in our library. So a polyglot, literally a many-language Bible. This breaks pretty much every rule in modern design principles. You're supposed to have a nice clear layout with lots of white space to help focus and rest the eyes. It's supposed to be uncluttered. You need to have consistent fonts, all that sort of thing. These are cluttered, they're messy, they're writing things in between the lines. There are lots of different, it's just a real mess. But it's also wonderful and a real breakthrough in terms of the ability to have in the one place multiple different languages dealing with the same text. It allows scholars and students alike to compare translation solutions and to understand why different translations came up with different solutions. Is it because there was a different text that lay behind that one? Is it because there was an obscure word or phrase which has been clarified by another version? These are sort of questions that people are asking when they start coming up against different translations, and they're trying to work out, well, how can I clarify which is more accurate. So it's, you can sort of go ad fontes, back to the source, and making these decisions yourself. That's the goal of a polyglot. Now, what polyglots don't generally do is show you different translations of the same language. That would be a completely different project. It's a luxury of modern times where we have multiple versions of the same, manuscripts of the same version, same language. They didn't necessarily have, back in the 16th century, they didn't necessarily have 5 or 10 different Greek versions and a dozen different Hebrews that you could sort of all put together and compare. You just sort of have the one that you decide is the best and go with that one. That said, when you do have different manuscript traditions, these are occasionally noted. However, the main purpose of polyglots is not to compare within one language, to compare different Greeks or different Hebrews or different Latins, but across languages. And you do that by looking at different languages, different versions. So in Bible scholarship world, we talk about versions as different ancient translations. And the idea is through these versions, we have access behind them to what they were translated from, the text they translate, what we call the Vorlagen, their prior editions. The most famous one isn't really much of a polyglot, but it's the most famous, which is Origen's Hexapla. So it had a 3rd century 6-columned work, which had the Hebrew written out in Greek, and then 3 different translations, and then this sort of other eclectic text, which is what we call the Septuagint, the traditional Greek translation. And he had lots of text notes and that sort of thing. So it was quite an amazing feat. Now, there are similarities to what he was doing in the 3rd century to what these polyglots are doing in the 16th century. There's, again, 6 columns. That's a lot of work, but there's only 2 languages, really. So it's not really a polyglot, but a diglot, if you want to be technical. And his goal was a bit different. He just wanted to work out which was the best Greek translation. I'm looking at the New Testament scholars to nod or shake their heads. So that's doing a bit of a different thing. But it was a monumental task which set the standard for hundreds and hundreds of years. Many centuries later, around the turn of the millennium, we start coming across different sorts of diglots and triglots, usually with Greek and Arabic, and depending on where you were, the third might be Coptic or Syriac or something like that. There's a famous Coptic Pentateuch, which is Coptic Egyptian, written in Egyptian script, but with an Arabic translation written in the margins to help. Again, so neither of them are biblical languages, Coptic and Arabic, but they're trying to get to what's going on there. In places like Egypt, diglots were very common. Greek Arabic diglots were also produced around this time. And I had a look at some on the internet, and there were some great ones. There's the Violet fragment, which has Greek and Arabic, but the Arabic is written in Greek script. So you're writing in different languages, which is just blows your mind. But again, like in medieval time, this is happening all the time, especially Hebrew and Arabic. They're writing, and sometimes they're writing so fast, they just keep switching between scripts, and it's super confusing when you're trying to read it. There's a 13th century triglot in Greek, Arabic, and Coptic. And then there's I think there's a 9th century Psalter, so Book of Psalms, that's in Greek, Syriac, and Arabic. So they are around, floating around the world before this time of the printing press. So, but again, you can imagine how much work is involved in those days. The primary purpose of a polyglot, as I said, is to help those with less competence in one language gain access to the other languages. Perhaps a bit like we saw with the Reader's edition earlier, as well as to establish what attributes of a text were due to the Vorlage, what lay behind it, and what was due to, say, the translation technique of the translator. And so you can do that well if you can compare different translations. We might do the same today. You might have if you only have one language but more than one translation, you might get out your NIV and your ESV and your CSB and your NKJV and you lie them all out and you compare what's going on in each of them. But if you don't have access to the Hebrew text, like, what else you can do? That's a pretty good way of trying to work out what's lying behind that. You can find out what's in common and what's different, what seem to be idioms. But if you can read more than one language, you have so much more access, and particularly if you have multiple languages, you can try and work out what's going on. Again, historically, this was really important for people who didn't have any access to Hebrew. The Greek translation spread a lot more than the Hebrew. I'm not saying it didn't exist or it was lost or anything like that, but people in, say, Syriac world or Arabic world, so Syriac and Arabic are part of the same sort of Semitic language group, and if they had access to the Hebrew, that would really help them work out what's going on in their translation. So they're reading their translation, they're like, what does this mean? Or why do my two Syriac translations say something different? But if you had the Hebrew on the side, and even if you couldn't read it, you could work it out because it's a very similar language. But as I understand it from my reading, for a large period of time, for many people, apart from their native tongue, they only had access, the only other version was the Greek Septuagint, a translation of the Hebrew, which again is fine, except then they're comparing it to quotes of the church fathers and they're quoting a different text. And so they're trying to work out, well, what's going on? Which one is wrong? Which one is right? Which one's more accurate? Which one helps me get closer? And it became a bit uncomfortable when they're getting new translations of the church fathers in their language, but they're saying different things to their translation. And so this is the regions where polyglot Bibles started popping up and really helping people and providing much food, particularly with the rise of Islam, where there were discussions about, is the Bible corrupted and that sort of thing. If you said, oh, well, let's look at different versions, we'll work out what's going on and we can decide, is it being corrupted or is it just a translation question? But again, that may not have helped because then you've got different versions and an Islamic apologist is going to say, see, your versions can't agree with each other. So whether it helped or not is for another time and another speaker. So again, that's sort of talking medieval time, late antiquity, but to come back to early modernity, especially with printing in the West, polyglot Bibles or books of the Bible really grew in popularity. The late 15th century into the 16th century saw starts being made. For example, there was a 1513 quintuplex Psalterium, so 5 different Latin translations, so they start realising that maybe the Vulgate isn't the best. But again, that's a bit more like Origin, multiples of the same language. But in 1516, there was a Psalterium octuplum, which had a handful of Latin, but also Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, and Aramaic. But Latin still playing very much an authoritative or adjudicating role. There were Jewish versions coming out at this time, so there was a bloke, Eliezer Soncino, in the mid-16th century, and he put together one with Hebrew and the Targum. So the Targum is the Aramaic sort of paraphrasey translation, and then Saadia's Tafsir, which is the Arabic translation, and a Judeo-Persian translation. So that's sort of the Hebrew they were speaking at that time, is Judeo-Persian sort of thing. And also a commentary by Rashi. And then I think a next edition replaced a couple of those languages with, say, Judeo-Spanish and Judeo-Greek to better serve the people. So they kept making new editions based on what people needed and what they could read and what would help them better. The famous, though, and most ambitious version produced at this time was the Complutensian Polyglot. It was completed, I think, in 1522. It cost a king's ransom to make and buy. I think a lot of it sunk when they first shipped it out to the Pope. So it was a bit awkward. And I don't think they made heaps of copies, and I think it probably bankrupted everyone involved. But it did act as a guide for future polyglots or future polyglottists, if that's a real word. Now, as you can see there, and you've been looking at it for 5 minutes already, you can see that you've got a format of the Latin Vulgate in the centre, encompassed on either side with the Greek Septuagint and the Hebrew, and this would flip on the alternate pages. So the Greek would always be towards the margin, towards the centre of the book, and the Hebrew would always be to the outer margin. And that would flip on each page. Although bizarrely, in a time where anti-Semitism was rife, they came up with an explanation for why this was the case, because Jesus was obviously represented by the Latin in the centre, crucified by the Jews and the Gentiles. So it's led to awful anti-Semitic comments, even though they still wanted to read the Hebrew, but they still didn't like Jews. Below this was the Targum Onkelos and a Latin translation of that besides it. So that's what's going on there. Again, quite a monumental work. But it really pales to what we have in our library here, which is Brian Walton's Polyglot. So this is a century or so later. Brian Walton produced his own Polyglot. It's a quantitatively better, more impressive work. We have it here in the John Robinson Library. It's widely known elsewhere as the London Polyglot, or if you like more syllables, the Walton Heptaglotton. It's named for Brian Walton, or Brianus Waltonus, if you want to be, if you want to turn your name Latin, just add an us on the end. Don't know how it works with Douglas. He was its main editor. If we can read anything into it, took a lot out of him. He died 4 years after it was published. It was published in 1657, but there's a second edition, which is the one I think we have. If you know your English history, there's a good way to work out why that's the case. The first edition said thanks to Cranmer to Cromwell for taking the tax off paper, so I could print this much more cheaply. But then in 1660, it was the restoration with Charles II. So he said, thanks a lot, Charles, although ironically Charles was very unhelpful. And anyway, that's another story. But although Erin and I had a look and we couldn't find the dedication to Charles, but it's on the listing, so it must be there somewhere. But there are 6 volumes and we have 8 copies of 8 volumes of the 6, so there's 2 doubles. So it'll be there somewhere. It was initially published from 1654 to 57. So it was in 6 volumes, which means you got 4 for the Old Testament and then 2 for the New Testament. I think 1 for the Gospels and 1 for the letters. Same number of volumes as the Complutensian Polyglot, but it outdid its predecessor in both in the breadth of the versions and the quality of the versions as well. So beyond Hebrew, Greek, Latin and Aramaic, you can see there it added several versions which are quite impressive, not just to have access to them, but to compile them and create the types for them so you could print it. Just quite astonishing. So there's Samaritan for the Pentateuch, there's Ge'ez, the language that the Ethiopian Bible's in, Arabic, Syriac, Persian or Farsi is there as well. Now, I guess most of these languages are in the Semitic family, with the exception of Greek and Latin. But if you learn one, you learn them all. That's sort of the, except for me, but that's the idea. But it will help you think about translation, like the directions of translation and what's going on in different ones, what possible alternatives lie behind them in the Vorlagen, which might give you access to the original, whatever that might mean, as well as what translation possibilities exist as we moving into these more modern languages. As you can see from the title page, there's a whole list of books, a bunch of books in his library that he used to help him. So he used Origen's Hexapla somehow. I don't know, it wasn't extant then, but anyway. He used the Complutensian Polyglot, Jerome's Vulgate, as well as a few other famous versions. This is consciously a compilation and an advancement on previous editions. And again, using the different biblical languages as well as the versions. Now, he didn't do it single-handedly. he had some mates helping him. Two of the names that stood out for me were James Ussher, who was most famous for working out when creation happened, and John Lightfoot, who's another famous scholar. If you're wondering how he managed to put it all together, he got a forced early retirement at the age of 42, got remarried after his wife died, and moved in with his wealthy father-in-law and just hung out putting this together. So that's how to do it. Now, it really is quite an effort. You can see that this is just the front matter, and it's quite... there's just a wealth of information, maps and tables and information on sources and languages. Here's a bit of a taster. You've got there, that's the first page of many of Ussher's famous table on the age of the earth, as he works back from the flood to creation. There's also, and again, that goes for several pages. There's also a page of coins from the Maccabean period written in Paleo-Hebrew. I don't know why you need that, but I guess if you're bored reading the rest of it, or you're like, I really can't work out Ge'ez, you can just have a look at some coins. It's good to have some pictures. In books, there's a table there of Paleo-Hebrew, so you can learn to read the script that's there. And there's a bunch of other languages as well, so it'll teach you how to read them if you can't read them. This is a table of money of different denominations and your conversion rate, so you can know how many drachmas to your... I don't know, I can't remember any off the top of my head. But you can do that sort of thing. And there are similar ones for distance as well, so you can work out how many furlongs to a Greek stadium or whatever. So there's all this sort of stuff there. There are glorious maps. That's the winding path of all the stops that Moses and the Israelites had. Here's a 90-degree twisted picture of the Holy Land with all the sites there, which is probably ripped from Eusebius. There's a sumptuous map of of Jerusalem back in the day. And there's also just pages and pages of architectural reconstructions of different buildings. So it's quite wonderful to look at it. I could go on. We could just spend an hour looking at the front matter. It's a glorious codex. And I didn't put a picture up here, but the last page of the front matter has stuck in a little note from Brian Walton saying, thanks a lot to all my backers, and a little, I showed you to all his haters. I finally did it. You said it would never happen, but it did. And then you finally turn the page and get to the text. So you can see immediately that it's like the Complutensian one, but there's so much more. The Complutensian one had 3 columns. This has 4 on a page. And he had 3 columns that then flip to the other side. Here you've got 4 different columns on the other side. So it's all automatically twice as much as the Complutensian one. So we're easily double. Each text gets its own Latin translation running alongside it. So here's your Hebrew with your interlinear. There's your Latin Vulgate. Here's your Greek. Here's your Latin of the Greek. Here's your Targum. Here's your Latin of the Targum. Here's your 2 different old Paleo sort of ones. And then here's your Latin of that. Here's your Arabic with the Latin. And then you've got your Syriac with that as well, your Aramaic. So it's quite astonishing how much has gone into this. Yes, and so again, the Hebrew, this is a bit of a zoom in. The Hebrew has its own Latin translation or it's interlinear, again in wooden reverse order, like our Reader's Bible from before. Still got the Vulgate. The Greek Septuagint is really the only one that gets proper notes alongside it. You can see the footnotes there in little brackets through the text in Greek letters. Tell us some of the differences between the text used here, which I think is Vaticanus, and then MSA, the manuscript Alexandrinus. So it was only that century that the Alexandrian Codex arrived. It was a gift to King Charles, very kind gift, and so he was able to use this for text criticism, which is a real score, and it clearly distinguished what Walton was doing with what his predecessors could do. They just simply didn't have access to good enough manuscripts. In the New Testament, there's one or two languages fewer, but again, it's another great feat. It's using Robert Stephanus's, it says there, Robert Stephanus's eclectic Greek text, which becomes a Textus Receptus, with inter... It doesn't have interlinear... No, it does. It does have interlinear Latin. And then, again, Syriac, Ge'ez, Arabic, Farsi, all with Latin translations. And, of course, the Vulgate is always going to be there. And, again, it's not flipped. It's just more of the same passage. One really nice thing I see here is Walton's really happy to include paratexts. So you can see that he's got the headings for the Syriac and actually all the Semitic languages, the Arabic and the Farsi as well. So he has little headings that were included in the manuscript. So they've kept that, and they did the same in the Old Testament. A couple of lines before Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, explaining what's going on and what this will be about. So again, I don't think they're suggesting it's original, but it's part of the tradition that's been passed down to have these lines before verse 1. And it's nice that they retain that for readers. They're not sort of, cutting bits out to save words or paper. Here's another page. I don't have much to say about this, except it looks really pretty. Ge'ez is just mad to read. I have no idea. But it's essentially a Semitic script, but it's not written right to left, it's written left to right. But I think it maps on to most Semitic alphabets. The only thing I would say, though, is you can see there you've got Ge'ez up the top, and the page before, Ge'ez was down the bottom left. So at some point, and Aaron and I had a look and we couldn't work out why, but at some point they just decided to swap where the Ethiopian goes. It's like, let's move it up the top. Maybe they just, as they kept going, they realised, we need more room for Persian or something, so we'll move the Ge'ez up top. I don't know. But again, I'll never cease to be amazed at the work that went into something like this. And you may or may not be surprised that I read yesterday that these were still, Walton's polyglot was still used up to last century. So this was still pretty much the gold standard for textual criticism if you're looking at different versions. So yes, we had better manuscripts, but this breadth and wealth is just unsurpassed, really. They're an impressive contribution to scholarship, and nothing really comes close to them. Just for fun, I thought I'd show you the end of Mark chapter 16. You can see there's a wealth of footnotes there, so they're starting to ask questions about what's going on in the longer ending of Mark and where that comes from. And I guess what we see here, especially by having Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, is there's a real concern to have accurate texts and encourage readers to be able to do the work themselves, teaching people where the manuscripts come from in all the front matter and even how to read the scripts. And ultimately, these are just wonderful for helping us get back in time and realise that we are just standing on the shoulders of giants who were standing on the shoulders of others. They went to extraordinary lengths to help us ad fontes, to help us get back to the source or as close as possible, and by the grace of God, we are able to keep working on these sorts of things. This is, I guess, the next step is being able to do all this on a computer, tagged in, sort of key text, that sort of thing. There's a Hebrew, English, Greek, Ge'ez, Latin, Syriac, Samaritan, 2 different targums. I could have put more, but I didn't want to. But that's quite wonderful. But what this is doing, this is trying to say, well, how do we do with a computer what Walton did, and Walton was saying, how can I do what Jimenez was doing, and how can I do what the diglots in Egypt were doing? So, look, that's probably all I have to say for tonight. An hour and 1 minute. If there are any comments or questions, or if there's anything I've missed or messed up, please let me know, but I'm very happy to be corrected. But otherwise, thanks very much for listening and participating.